So again, where's the magic? You know, AIS, the Application Interface Services, that's where the studio now lives in these later tools releases along with AIS. And again, the beauty of this is it's allowing you to define what interface. You just have this API you're creating, your programming interface, you're exposing that to whoever, you know, it could be customers, it could be mobile apps, you know, the UX1 interface uses that. It can be a watch, but anything that can consume a REST API, you can build these things. You know, a lot of customers now have, again, realized this is not, originally they talked about it was for IoT, Internet of Things. Well, we quickly realized, like working with Stanley Engineered Fastening, that, you know, this isn't just IoT. I mean, devices are great, but we can do a whole lot more with it. So it quickly expanded into integration, and you saw where JDE had used it for their mobile apps. I know they had some announcements this year where they're moving away from those and allowing the customers and the business partners to do their own mobile apps. Like again, we've been doing what we call our mobility product. I know I sound like a product advertisement, but the mobility we were doing when AIS came out, even before orchestrations. So, you know, what we did is we took a lot of things from the high-end side and the things that the mobile apps offered and tried to combine it all together. But that was the power of having AIS service calls along with orchestrations. So we've been able to build and expand over the years and got quite a library of applications. Bottom line of all this, though, is by changing and getting this flexibility, you know, again, JD Edwards having this foresight to build this REST API, it's really given us, you know, the ability to expose that JD Edwards, that logic, that data that you've spent, you know, months, years building and expertise, now that other things can use it. Again, it can be the Oracle Cloud. Like we also had one where on a third-party system for the CSS portal, they had where they're using more the traditional, where they call it what we call the XML call object, the business functions. They use that interoperability. But there was a place in one of the areas there where it was wanting to do supply and demand and go all the way down to the bottom and get the total. And that was taking anywhere from 45 to 80 seconds to do that. Well, we wrote an orchestration to do the same thing, and it comes back in like 1 to 2 seconds. So there are some really good value adds that you can get out of this. The general thing that we look at is anything that somebody's doing manually, clipboard-wise or writing stuff down, those are some opportunities right away, some obvious quick wins that you can do to automate. So the big thing on the CNC side, I'll touch on this, but is the architecture. Basically, again, CNC gives us that flexibility that we can tweak and tune it. So what you put into non-prod, like for development, is generally, less servers and less instances than you might use for prod. The runtime architecture, though, for like production, generally you want, like I have over here, is an AIS server paired with an HTML server where most of the web users in production are coming into the main one like they've always have, but then you're not adding any additional load to that HTML server. You're putting it through any AIS or orchestration request can go through the pair there, which works out really nice. One caveat to that, though, is once you get up to Tools 925, an enhancement that we requested last year that they put in there is the AIS log on demand. So what that means is if you're on the earlier tools, 924 and below, whenever you logged in on the web to the HTML as a web user, most would probably didn't even know it, but it would also initiate an AIS connection and then also to whatever HTML server it was trying to go to. So what's that mean is if I had 100 users on, I would have 100 more AIS and JAS sessions. So that's another reason why it was separate. Now with this log on demand, like I've got a customer that went live with several hundred users last week, and that AIS log on demand, all of those connections are gone. The only thing that we're actually using now is our orchestrations. and the mobility and things like that. Then if the user does an AIS type of transaction, then it initiates because they're actually using it. So again, to me, that was a common sense type thing, but it's very powerful. And if you like the old way, you can turn it back on and make it behave the way it used to. But you know, for us, it's saved a lot of resources, obviously, because now we don't have to open up those AIS sessions and use the memory and HTML and all that. So very, very powerful there. But this concept of pairing an AIS and an HTML, I'll talk about it a little bit more. The neat thing about that is this can scale depending on how your business changes over time or what type of orchestrations or notifications and so forth that you're using. It's not something that's set in stone. You have a lot of flexibility, and actually we've had customers where, again, they start out and they just have a single AIS HTML and they have several web servers. Then, as time goes on, they started doing more orchestrations. They implemented other feature functionality. They expanded that out. They may have dedicated some for, you know, barcode scanning or for notifications or scheduling and so forth. So a general rule of thumb, though, is you know, like what I talked about here. For development, maybe prototype. It just depends. A lot of times, prototype I'll try to mirror what production has, as far as the architecture, at least in a smaller scale. But like development, you can have the AIS server point back to the same development instance, because usually you're going to have less than 10 to 20 users in your web development side. Again, if you have lots of people in web development or in DV, so to speak, and maybe you split that out. Like I said, though, the main assumption is that this thing is going to do that AIS request. Then it's going to go in and initiate another Jazz session and so forth. And then on top of that, if you've implemented any of the 10 ADF applications, basically that could open up another session, and that's a whole nother server. Most customers aren't using the ADF built-in pieces, so it's not as big a concern. But you know, there are those out there that use it. So the main thing, again, like I was just touching on briefly, though, is you may want to dedicate multiple AIS Jazz instance pairs depending on what you're doing. So again, if you decide your company wants to use a lot of the UX1 graphs, those jet graphs, you may want to have either on the same server that your web server is on or dedicated for maybe one or two instances. You may want it to split all that out so that it stays very performant. Because again, those graphs or enterprise one search and all that tends to use more resources and takes a little more time in some cases than just regular web transactions. Another one, though, is mobility. Like in our mobility product, some people want their timeouts to be significantly less than what their regular web users are. So like your regular web might be an hour, 2 hours. Mobility, you probably don't want it, if someone just shuts down their app, you probably don't want it to sit there and take 2 hours to time out. So again, if you have another set of instances for that, an instance pair, you maybe set that timeout to 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The only thing caveat again there is don't go below 10 minutes. There seems to be some unspoken pieces within WebLogic, especially WebSphere, is that some of these session timeout mechanisms, they don't like going below 10 minutes because actually they're running and sometimes they just don't go below that limit, and that threshold, it'll have a problem. So usually, again, 20 minutes, 10 minutes is the lowest. Most customers are keeping their mobile maybe in that 20 to 30 minute if they have to have a timeout and so forth. But another example is if you've got some large orchestrations, let's say you're doing large volumes of data, you're pulling back maybe 1,000, 10,000 rows at a time for something, you may want to have, you know, some dedicated AIS Jazz pairs for that, HTML pairs. And that way, again, there you're sizing the resourcing like the Java heap and so forth to handle that. And another one is scheduled jobs. So there's a number of pieces there. The big one that's kind of been gaining steam is notifications, watch lists. More and more customers are starting to take advantage of that. So again, with notifications, you may find that you discover the joy of notifications and how it can alert you, tell you certain things, monitor stuff. So, you're just taking actions on exceptions as opposed to having to watch something all the time. So you're like, an example for us CNCs is we can have a watch list or a notification, and if a job errors, we can have it go in and just, send us an email or send us a text. So, and that stuff works really well. But again, depending on how you set the notification up, whether it's shared or whether it's doing it individually for the user, which is more overhead, you may want to break those out. And the other part is realizing if you do implement like the relatively new scheduler that is in for orchestrations, I think it came out in 9224, somewhere in there. I always forget those numbers, so I apologize. But loading up that scheduler, and it does take more memory and processes to do it, but it's a really nice way. Again, in 924, they've actually give you a screen, web pages, so that you can manage it instead of having just to use actual REST commands to control it. So that's the architectures, though. Couple little things, though. Again, want to emphasize, if you are not on tools 924 or 925 and you're wanting to do orchestrations, I really strongly recommend that you examine that. You'll be able to get away from the ADF Classic Orchestrator Studio, which is a separate server. It's fairly complex. I even had a complete presentation just on how to install the ADF server a number of years back. Now with tools 924 and above, the Studio is included as part of the AIS instance. So it makes our job much easier. That Studio is much more reliable and definitely works better. Any of you that have worked with orchestrations with what we call the Classic Studio now that runs in ADF, you usually have the mantra save and save often so that you don't lose the work or you lose your place when you've done a number of things. I've actually had, just even in some of these latest upgrades, that we've had some where the Studio saved it, but a couple columns didn't get saved. And it would cause a strange issue with that orchestration, and just discovered this like 2 weeks ago. Basically in DV, there was one orchestration that wouldn't come up in the list. In PY, there were two, and it was all because it didn't put two pieces of information in a couple columns about that UDO. So that's some of the fun things you have there. Then another tip, though, if you are back on these older ones, like I said, the primary recommendation is you can get more people in on the ADF if you want to, but try to get to those higher tools if you can. Now I sound like Oracle, but there is a lot of value there by getting to those later tools and those, the features, functionality, and even bug fixes. Real quick, this was a big one 3 or 4 years ago. Like I said, this is one of those I'll be kind of moving out, but the previously, before some of the older tools releases, you couldn't even install this through Server Manager for a CNC. We had to do the ADF install and everything by hand. So again, as long as you're up on these later tools, you won't have to worry about that. Like I said, you get to 924, it gets even simpler, much less complex because there is no ADF server to worry about. So again, Application Development Framework. I know I'm throwing out acronyms, but if you don't know that, ADF is what they built their Oracle built its Fusion applications on, and a number of things. Like I said, JDE Edwards uses it for about 10 applications that they developed a few years ago that they maintain. And like I said, here's just a recap. We'll go through this real quick, but as long as you're on tools 9212 or later, you can install the Studio through the Server Manager now instead of having to do all of those manual steps. Again, another one that I've seen, though, that some people miss is Oracle's done a better job here in the last couple of years explaining this. It's been out there on the Oracle support site, but it's a subtle one in that again, a lot of the changes that JD Edwards is doing, of course, is in the web and the orchestrations. So let's say that you put yourself on tools 9241, and that's what you went live with. So your enterprise servers, deployment server, and everything else are there. A lot of people, some customers are resistant then to taking other tools in that year just because of maybe testing and so forth. But an advantage that they have is what's called the web maintenance pack strategy, which means you don't have to update. You can do what we call the full tools and just say, like, you want to go to tools 9245, you could. But the other thing you can consider is the web maintenance is you're taking just Server Manager, the HTML, and the AIS. So it's a much smaller footprint of what you have to test. You're mainly affecting the web and the orchestrations or an AIS, along with Server Manager. Of course, Server Manager you can update at any point. It's always downward compatible. It's just not forward compatible. But again, that could be a strategy. We've done that for several customers that have some pretty large installations, and they wanted to take advantage of orchestration. Like they were on tools 9221, but some of the feature functionality that they needed, the minimum levels, they needed to be up at like 9224. So in that particular case, we did a web maintenance update, took them up to like 9225 for that particular customer, and then that way they didn't have to, redo all the enterprise servers and the deployment server and all that. Again, if you can do the full tools, that's great, but this is a way for you to take those fixes in a lower impact level, even than what a full tools can do. And another caveat, again, if you got a Server Manager agent for Windows, just make sure these latest releases that you put the Visual Studio runtimes on. If not, you'll know because it won't install. Again, the big thing here, this was a take just to say, and I sound like a broken record, I know I do, but Tools 924X was a watershed tools release of getting the studio as part of AIS. The other great caveat that gave is if you were BlueStack, IBM WebSphere, before you had to have at least the components. The ADF server was WebLogic only. It still is. So you had to put that studio over in the ADF instance there. Now you can do with 924, you can put that on WebSphere or it could be in WebLogic. Again, if you were to ask me what my recommendation is, though, and I put that at the bottom, but they're primarily testing with WebLogic. So if you can run the WebLogic for your Oracle web instances and AIS and so forth, that would be the recommended direction. The WebSphere, it works. And again, we've had customers for several years now that are using it. The only thing is that we sometimes get in that push and pull of we get into an issue with WebSphere, we got to work with IBM, we have to work with Oracle, and one side says, well, it's somebody's app that, you get a little bit of finger pointing. And so sometimes there are issues that may crop up a little bit more on the WebSphere side. That's just consulting experience. Again, I had this go live for this large customer we just did. They were primarily all WebSphere, and we have now switched them off of the WebSphere over to WebLogic on Linux. So they've got a 400 on the back end, and the enterprise service and all that runs there, but now the web is running there. And the Linux servers are running really well, and we even had measurable response improvements from our Clarity app. I mean, we're seeing before their best response time to the desktop was 100 milliseconds. Now we've got some that's 60 milliseconds. It's a 40% improvement in certain things just by going to later code, getting it updated, going to Linux and so forth. All right, again, remember this one sometimes it's my 3-time rule. Certain things I repeat 3 times because I'm trying to drive those home. But again, if you can get to 925X, you can minimize those extra AIS jazz sessions. If not, you just got to account for it in your architectures. So again, if you're on 923, 924, you can do that. One of the things that has been happening over time is initially the default was for the heap for AIS was 256 meg. Again, now with the later tools and more things, we've been bumping those up more in the 512 megabyte to 2 gig range or 2048 meg. Again, it really just depends on what you're running. If you're just doing AIS calls like from UX1, you could go with less. But if you start doing full-blown orchestrations, or if you get into Groovy scripts, notifications, scheduler, those type of things, again, large JSON results. Again, they have done some things in 925 to help with those large JSON results as well, but you're going to have to bump it up just because the heap will get exhausted a little bit faster. Yeah, we just touched on what the classic orchestrator needs. Again, it's the older WebLogic levels, again, Studio there. And my big thing is it happens almost every week. Out on Oracle support, the E1 documentation, Learn JDE, this stuff's changing constantly. So use those resources, try to go to that, make sure that you're staying up to date by revisiting those. Learn JDE is really good in that a lot of the actual training, the Oracle by examples, and those type of things are there. They've also got a lot of good documentation. Support site's really good, of course, of pointing to. Oracle does a really nice job, because sometimes I beat them up. It's like, are you going to put a support doc out about this so that somebody else doesn't have to go through the pain that we went through on this particular SAR or enhancement? And then E1 documentation, being on the web, they do a pretty decent job of keeping that updated. Not always, but when in doubt, always go to that documentation. I've gotten burned by some things where I went back and said, hey, you put this out on the support site, but you didn't update the E1 docs. I had that in an upgrade for the AS400 side, where they changed the requirements on what we call the lob locator thresholds. Anyways, we had to increase that. Well, that wasn't documented except in one little document on the support side. It's like, no, this needs to be in the upgrade docs and the install docs so that we don't run into this issue, because we actually do new installs and we actually still do a lot of upgrades. So highlights, though, features and tips. So this now is moved, and I put a reference up here. It used to be a frequently asked question doc out on Oracle support. Now they put it over on Learn JDE, and I really like it because what they've done is each of these, they actually will have a link. So you can go and see what more detail, instead of just the one row description, you can go in and they'll give you more detail about that particular feature and what they've done with it. So definitely recommend going up to the Learn JDE site into this Oracle doc here and use that to stay up to date when they release, like when 924 comes out, there'll be some nice things in there. But again, I'm not going to read all of these to you, but you get different feature functionality. The OAuth client ID and that putting into the body, that's pretty good for certain REST calls and authentications that you need to do that we didn't have for a while. Again, putting array variables out, that's going to help for passing those outbound to somebody else to consume. That select mobile rows in a form request, that's a really neat feature in being able to act like a user. Now, before you had to do some gyrations, or a lot of times you would have to do Groovy scripts. You had to build the intelligence to, like if you had something return 10 rows, but you didn't want just the first row and maybe the second row or whatever, or all 10 rows, maybe that you needed certain ones for whatever reason. But now you have that ability to do that. So what they've done is they've taken a lot of functionality that maybe we had to do it in Groovy scripts, program it, and they're trying to move some of that into the orchestration itself, into the tool to make things a little bit easier when there's been enough requests from the business partner community and you customers. Obviously, again, if you want the enhancement, the Quest group is always good for that, the SIGs, but also just putting enhancement requests in. I'll just look down the bottom one. Yeah, in 9.2.5, that's when they came out with that login on demand feature. The optimized retrieval, that was one. Yeah, that one actually I worked with them on that, because we actually had some customers where they want to do extracts of like item master. So they've come up with some ways now to compress it, and also to, when it's pulling it in 1,000 at a time, so that basically it doesn't beat up. What was happening is the HTML side would pump out 1,000 rows at a time, which was great. We've had that for a while. But then the AIS, it just dump it all into the AIS side. So then it basically exhausts the heat there. So they've done some ways to help mitigate that. And as you can see here, here's just a quick recap. But on 9.2.4, like I said, this was across the board. This is more of the 9.2.4.1 through 9.2.4.5. But there was a number of things, and I'll touch on some of these. But they added quite a few different pieces of functionality there. The HTTP compression helps across the network. Sometimes it can help in between AIS and JAS. But you had arrays in the CSV files so that you could read in arrays from them. Being able to call business functions from an orchestration step, that was probably, that's a little bit more advanced. But like for us, that was a really nice win for what we call our scannability product that we do for barcoding. Basically, there's some areas where we know what to call, what information we need from a business function. So it's a lot faster to do it that way, and instead of having to call an application form or come up with a custom app, perhaps even. And so that was a big time saver and speed saver there. And again, I highlighted in purple, but also embedding orchestrations without having to do connectors. It's just a way of simplifying some of that. So again, a lot of nice features. The big one for 9.2.4 though was putting Orchestrator in with the AIS and being able to use it there. The only thing that got left behind, if you're still an Internet Explorer 11 fan, it is not supported on IE 11. So, and as you get into these later tools, you're going to find more and more things are IE 11 just doesn't have some of the newer web standards. You need to be Chrome, Firefox, Safari, or Edge. But the bottom line is some of the stuff just won't work if you try that. Another quick one that's off to the side is a CNC one, but the color coding that came out. So you can actually set the banner colors of your web. So like you can make development red and prototype a different color, or even prod. That works fine for the Chrome and Firefox, Safari browser, and all that. But IE 11 won't support that. So just another caveat that if you are in IE 11, definitely be looking at ways to be migrating away from that. And we've seen pretty good uptake in that area. But the other one on this, the last ADF application of the Orchestrator Studio, the classic, yeah, they put it on WebLogic Server 12.2.1.3. It's version 8. The only reason you have this is if you have the legacy orchestrations, that was V1 or V2. So if you created them and you created these orchestrations, version 1 was real way back, like 9.1.5, early 9.2, and then version 2 came out in the mid 9.2. So version 3 is what the new studio in 9.2.4 uses. And that'll be another tip I talk about. So if you want to edit them in the new studio, you basically want to migrate them up to version 3. The only caveat there is, like everything, back it up, make a save of it, export, and so forth. They'll run, version 1, version 2 will run just fine. It's just that you can't edit them unless you have the old classic to maintain them. The point is, though, is why have multiple editors if you don't have to? Try to make a concerted effort over time. Take your time, but make an effort to get them converted over to version 3. We have seen, again, I'll give a little bit of experience, but I have seen some cases where version 3 doesn't work quite right. The response doesn't come back properly, and you have to recreate the orchestration and sometimes the service request. That seems to be happening a little bit more often in 9.2.5 than it did in 9.2.4. And primarily it was ones that, I think there's even an Oracle support doc, but it was ones that were created in 9.2.3 as version. Again, a little thing to be aware of there. Notifications, though, again, if you haven't looked at notifications, definitely something to be researching. Again, what's nice about them is you can have the system look for certain events. You know, like if you, instead of you going and trying to see if a customer went over their credit limit or something, you could have a watch list if, you know, again, if you got the licensing for that. I won't get into that, I'm just the technical side, but if you can do a watch list, or you could have a, you know, a notification. You can have an orchestration look for it, and you could send a notification to let you know. And again, those have been out since 9.2.2. A lot of things in the Oracle support doc, that 2310 804.1. Definitely some good reference there. There were some problems that, again, if you're on 9.2.3.3 or earlier, you had to be aware of where special characters would cause some problems. Again, this is for some of the older ones. And I've seen this recently, just earlier this year, where a customer had configured what they call their global node, and notifications wouldn't work. And I think it was also the scheduler wouldn't start because they had put custom global node configurations for their enterprise servers. So again, that's always something that has to be checked to see if you've got the global node configuration set up, which isn't there always by default. Later releases, sometimes it is, but. And again, there's a bunch of support docs that I reference here. I'm just going to go through these. Basically, if anybody wants the presentation, we'll make sure that it's available. You can send email to Diane or something like that. We'll definitely, I know I go through these quickly. But this gives you some ways to reference back. Groovy scripting, though, again, this is kind of a savior for us on the ERP suite side, in that it allows us to do some things programmatically. So Groovy is kind of basically a subset of Java. But what it does is it allowed us to do manipulations, calculations, going through grids and so forth. In some cases, create CSV files and items like that. It's really a service request. It's just text that's pasted into that. But the nice thing about it is, if you do have Java background or developers, you could leverage them if the Orchestrator Studio can't do what you need it to do. A lot of times you can use Groovy. I mean, we've got Groovy also working in cases like for barcodes and so forth. So where you can go in and scan the barcode libraries, and that kind of stuff comes through, and then also handles the Groovy also handles the print output. So some neat things you can do there. Again, learn JDE, favorite place. If you really like the open source, you can go to the Apache side about Groovy and learn more than you probably want to know about it. But definitely some nice pieces there. Scheduler, definitely like this. You know, a lot of times I'll tell customers that the E1 scheduler that's on the enterprise server is not going to put any of the third-party schedulers out of business, you know, based on the features and functionality. You know, the regular E1 scheduler is just a good, simple, run this at a certain time this many times. If you want to do more than that, like dependencies or anything of that nature, it really won't do that. The Orchestrator Studio scheduler, though, again, in 9.2.4 and above, now they have a web page that you can use to control it with, and so you can have it launch notifications and orchestrations for you. The other neat thing about it is, though, you could use that for launching actual UBEs, because you can do report services that run UBEs and pass into the orchestration, you know, the report and the version. So you can put data section overrides and things like that if you really want to get that sophisticated. So the nice thing about that is, again, you will have, with this open source scheduler, more flexibility. A lot of them are just running, certain orchestrations that they want at a certain time, or, they want to go have an outbound where it goes retrieve something from some REST service. It'll do that, say, every 30 minutes or every hour or 4 times a day, whatever. It's really nice in that respect, and it also uses what's called the cron tab, which is basically cron is, again, open source, but you can get little things that will make it easy for you to convert it over. Say, like, I want this to run every week on a Friday at 5 o'clock. You can put that in you just search on a web page, and it'll give you the actual cron string that you need to do, and you just pop that in as a schedule that you want to put into the orchestration scheduler. Say that right 3 times. So another one, though, is the possibility of there are other schedulers out there called Quartz Desk that I haven't had any customer take advantage of it, but you could do it through that. That's a Java-based scheduler. Some of the things that we do, like I've got one now with these WebLogic servers and a 400, there's schedulers on the 400. So we've just installed some of the open source, like the curl command and a couple other open source commands that we need. We are doing Q-shell scripts that will go in and talk to Server Manager to shut down the web instances when they want to shut it down. And then, when they're ready to fire it back up, when they bring the enterprise server back up, fires up the web. So, yeah, there's a lot of nice flexibility here. Just a quick screenshot. Like I said, it works out pretty well. The one caveat with it is, by default, it's in what's called memory. So you normally run the scheduler on one AIS instance. So if you had like several of them, 4 or 5 in production, you would probably just want to run it on one, unless you want to implement what's called scheduler resilience, which means it's storing it in the database. And that way, each of the schedulers can read the database table to know, somebody's processing this, somebody's using that, that type of thing. So, but it works really, really well. It's got auto start features and so forth. So when you take the instance down and back up, it just fires back up. Process recorder. This is a lot of the business and developers, are really finding this a useful tool. It's great because when you want to create the orchestration, this will get you the framework of what you're trying to do. So, again, process recorder, once you enable it, essentially what you're doing is say, like, I wanted to do an orchestration on doing a sales order. I wanted it to enter some sales order lines. I could go the traditional route and go through the studio and type in the names and the forms and the version that I wanted to use, and then what data from what columns in the grid and so forth that I needed. Or you can use this process recorder and just step through a sample of the process. So you do the steps, let it record it, you save those off, and then those service requests you just bring into an orchestration in Orchestrator Studio, wrap around it, and you have some tweaks that you have to do. But the bottom line is it's a great time saver and can make it easier to do that. Again, it does take some time to get used to it, to learn the nuances of it. It's not always 100% on every piece of a process that you do. Like example, I brought up radio buttons, especially when you had mobiles. Earlier, again, this is why I keep harping about the tools releases, but they solved some of that in Tools 924. If you had mobile radio buttons to select a piece of data, previously in those, you'd actually have to have a little bit of XML experience. You could go into the XML and edit it after you created the service request to get it to set those. But now, again, in 924, you have the ability to use those radio buttons like they're drawn up. Again, it didn't recognize grid icons was another one, and then there was also things what we call pause resume. Again, I'm not going to each one of these, but these were very valuable. And again, all this came from people using the product, putting in enhancements, suggestions, and Oracle's done a really good job, in my opinion. I will give them some kudos there, or some love, however you like to call it, of listening and building this and making it better. So connectors, event calls, report services, and import-export. Again, these are some things that have come out over time. A lot of it came in the 923 as far as like REST calls. This is one, it's one of mine because we actually put that in as an enhancement to help us with, it used to basically, if I needed to make an AIS call, like say I needed to go get media objects and do something with them, I'd have to make another call out to AIS. So then I open up another session. Well, if I had 100 lines, that was 100 sessions. That just didn't fly real well. So what they did is in the connector give you the ability to call that same AIS instance you're using, and so it just reuses the same session. So now again, we're not using up our resources, and it works more efficiently. And then again, external connectors that get to REST services comes in real handy. And then database connectors, got to be a little bit careful with those because you're doing direct access to a database. It does have some security concerns as well that you have to look for, but you can use that to go, use a JDBC connection to talk to a MySQL database. It doesn't have to be a supported JD Edwards. You just have to have a proper JDBC driver loaded in AIS for it to use it. So some neat features there. FTP connector, again, this is nice in that now you can basically send and receive files. You just have to have an FTP service. Another big one, and I know a lot of developers use this. We've used it a number of times, but being able to invoke orchestrations from event rules, tables, applications. You can also do them also from form extensions, which is really nice. So you have a lot of capability there. The part I talked about, the report service, again, it's that subset of service requests. The report service, I should have put report service there, not report servers, but anyways, report service, basically you can just list off the UVEs and have the data selection and all those particular things, but you can override it as well if you want to. So you can pass in to that service request or that orchestration at the higher level. You can pass it in, and maybe you need to change the data selection it's doing. Again, this is kind of where I talked about you could use the scheduler to do some of that. So you're getting some capabilities like you traditionally had with the run UB XML, or like you do when you just submit a batch job through batch versions or from a task. The CSV connector, they've been working on that. They continue to work on it. The big thing is it can import CSVs just fine, but right now it still hasn't had the capability. That's coming. Don't know when, but it's coming to export, natively. Again, they have examples where you can do Java, Groovy, and you can write it out. But again, you got a program for that. It does have the capability though that you can mix and match JSON and XML. So you could have JSON coming in and then have XML coming out, or vice versa, or it could all be XML in and XML out. There's caveats there where JSON and XML fairly close on some of the typing and things that they can do, but it's not always perfect. There are some restrictions, especially with names and so forth, that XML has more restrictions than JSON does. So you have to watch that. But again, I'll talk about support, documentation, partner sites. We even have a number of blogs that out on our ERPsuites.com website. So, and a number of our people that do orchestrations and so forth, we've put some. Diane's been very nice about teasing out information from us, and we put some blogs out there. Health Monitor. This is one I really like a lot. You can get to it from a couple ways. One is there's an E1 page, basically compose page, but you can get to it and monitor it from a high level, and also see the you get some watch lists and also the work center. So this is one way where you could use this page and see how the orchestrations that you're permitted to see, you could be monitoring through that. There's also an external app, the P980060X, and that works really well where you can just fast path to it. There's also, again, if you've downloaded, you put the tools on and so forth, you'll also have it on a menu on your Enterprise One Lifecycles So I just save a favorite to it and use that to be able to monitor it. I put down the bugs. If you're on 9.2 or 9.1 apps, you can use these bug numbers to go and get the latest one, because they do update it. Because I had one where I did an upgrade from 9.1 to 9.2. The 9.1 UDO for the health monitor didn't work, so basically I just had to replace it with a new one for 9.2. Then we're fine. He was happy. But again, that's one of those little subtle ones that's like, it didn't tell you that. But you get the hint when you go to it and it doesn't work. It doesn't take long to figure that out. So I touched on the AIS initialization. The assertion framework, I think this one's going to build some steam. It's just going to take some time. But what's really nice about it is you can build test scripts now. And again, the assert in that I want the data to be in a certain range. So again, now you can have test scripts and you're putting data in, and if someone puts something, like the order a quantity of 1 million, and that's not really a valid thing to do, you can put a range in there and say, order quantities need to be in this range, or we're expecting, this particular UDC to be these values, so that your test scripts can flag that type of stuff when you're throwing in test data. Again, I talked about the mobile rows, the form request, where it used to be a custom Groovy script, array outputs. We touched on that. The other one is kind of, excuse me. But another one is the enhanced configuration. This affects people that have mobile AIS servers. Usually with the biggest one in effect, let's say like you're a 400 or a Unix, you may just have one enterprise server. So if you have mobile AIS servers, in the enterprise server INI, you could only call one environment. So now what they've done is they set up soft coding records, so you can use those per environment to say, which AIS server and so forth, what JAS server it should go to. It just makes it a little bit more flexible, so you weren't locked into just one environment. And that last one there, the stateless high volume load balancing, haven't had a chance to play with that, but basically that's a special use case where let's say probably a good example would be if Amazon, one big customer, and they're going to send you 10,000 orchestrations, and you want to handle that in your system instead of having it out in the cloud. Let them deal with it. You could use the stateless high volume load balancing so that you can set up a mix of servers. I won't get into the details too much, but the bottom line is it'll allow you, instead of you plugging it into one server and just beating it up where it couldn't handle that, you can have a mix of it where the request starts to come into one, but it can go across to other servers. They're all going to share the request, the session cookie and so forth. So the bottom line is it allows you to handle that concurrent load much easier. Again, I know I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He said, I haven't had the customer situation yet that requires it. I got one or two, though, that may be asking about it here in the next year or so. Again, just recaps on 9.2.4. I kind of wish I had my poll so I could find out where you guys are at tools-wise, but the bottom line is 9.2.4 and 9.2.5 is really, if you're wanting to do orchestration, it's really where you want to be. So the bottom line, though, is they introduced getting the studio in AIS, definitely big change there. Being able to do the business functions, again, the custom service request, that was really nice. Having the debugging, that was a situation. I had one where it would have been, it came out like 3 weeks after I had gone through all this debugging through the AIS logs. If I had the debugger, I probably could have done it in less than 4 hours, or maybe even a couple hours. It's taken a while to get used to it. But the debugger is nice because you can step through, you can actually change the results, see what those orchestration steps are doing. Again, the orchestration, being able to call another orchestration without using connectors, just simplifies those orchestrations quite a bit. Again, the Studio UI was a big one. A little one was just a little fit and finish, but the timeout warning. Let's say your AIS server that you're logged into for Studio, you set it to 30 minutes. now it'll actually pop a warning message just like it does with the HTML web client. So another big one that, again, it helps us CNCs, but there were sometimes in the studio where you would have errors unless you knew to go into the browser and put it in, F12 into developer mode. You wouldn't see that the script was having errors. Now they'll actually send it back into the AIS log, so at least we know to go look. Little things like that. And then the Open API, the Swagger documentation, that's making it easy and easier for REST services that want to consume that. They can use the Open API to go in there and say, what does this REST call do? What fields do I need to put into it and so forth. It's a way of automating and documenting it, making it a little bit easier there. And another one was just AIS. It has less exposure than like an HTML does, so it's fairly secure. It said that the database connections are the one area where you might get a SQL injection if you left it kind of open, exposed. But again, most of this stuff, as long as you're exposing that AIS directly out into the internet, it's fairly secure. So been pretty happy on that. Knock on wood, but I haven't seen anything to date with those servers. Again, another reminder though, this is the one we run into all the time. Ran into it today, as a matter of fact. But UDO, view security, basically UDO security, it locks everything down. It's a closed door approach. So depending on the security that you've done, a lot of times we'll open up the service request and all the sub UDOs for orchestrations, but then we limit the access at the orchestration level. So it just makes the administration easier, because if you can't run the orchestration, you're not going to be able to run the service request or anything else. But the main thing is when you create something new, depending on your security, if you don't have any security for it, once you go to share it, nobody else can run it. Only when it's personal, you're allowed to run it, but that's it. So it's just something, again, the view security is something to keep in mind, because we've had a number of times where someone will do it, they'll give it to a user or a role, and then they say, well, we want that out for this group, or we want it public. Someone forgets, but they'll go out and publish it, but the object got published, but they didn't put the security in, so they can't run it. That's happened more times than I care to remember. But again, you've got a number of Orchestrator clients, SOAP UI, Postman, curl. Even in your browsers, you can download your own REST calls there. And actually, I use that in both Chrome and Firefox. So some good things there. A lot of good examples. I put a reference on that as well. And I've already reached 3 o'clock. See, I talk too much sometimes. I apologize. We'll just go through these, but again, the REST API, there's a lot of good documentation, different types of authentication methods. The base 64 is just numbers where it takes the name and the password, and you can go out and do it that way. Again, determining whether you do gets or posts, anything with a body you're going to use a post for. With SSL, that helps keep that encrypted. Gets are going to be in a header, may or may not be encrypted, depending on what you're doing. But again, a lot of orchestrations are what we call stateless. They just run, they do what they need to do, and then they're done. So you don't have to actually log in and get a token or something, but other ones you may. And large orchestrations, we've run into this a number of times, but again, if you're pulling back lots of rows, the client might have a default timeout of like 60 seconds. So you want to keep that stuff in mind where they say, well, I'm just not getting it. I don't get your data. And a lot of times if you see the orchestration ran and everything was fine, it turns out to be, like I said, the server side. Sometimes it can be on the enterprise server and all that, depending on what you're asking it to do. Another one, though, we've run into, the CNCs, we do this for the WebLogic servers, but what we call the maximum parameter requests, I just make it a point. We always set these up to 500,000 on all the AIS and web instances, because now AIS, with the more data and everything they return, is getting to the point where it'll reach that 10,000 parameters too, pretty easily. So something to think about there. Yeah, paging features, I already mentioned that, about 1,000 rows at a time just keeps your Jazz server from running out of memory. Again, stateless, you might want to make sure that you do a token request to reuse the system. It's a lot faster, more efficient. And yeah, there were some bugs in the court scheduler before 924. So again, another reason I get to consider 924. And 9243 was the business function calls, debugging, and monitor exceptions. Again, that one's good. It just depends on the settings. So we've kind of asked them maybe to have a way to have warnings not set up at a 500 HTTP level. This is something internal for the monitor. Sorry. There we go. So we got to the summary. I went 3 minutes over, but like I said, if you have time, you want to ask questions, we can do that as well.